Monday, September 12th, the day after the anniversary of September 11th, 21 years ago. And tonight we have a very special guest with us, a very experienced guy that I've gotten to know in campaign circles. His name's Dave Huguenel, and he has Oregon roots going back to 2015, 2016, when he served as the executive director for the State House Caucus, Republican Caucus. And he's also, in 2020, he headed up the Trump War Room, served in there, and was a regional political director. He's a lecturer at the Leadership Institute, which is a very important entity for all of us in political circles. And he serves as a fellow at the Loyola University Institute of Politics. Dave, welcome to the show tonight.
Kevin, thanks for having me. It's always good to see you. Like I said, I look forward to seeing you in a few days in person as well.
Yep, we're going to be at the Reagan dinner in Washington County, where they're going to have a guest of Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State. So another great event. And Republicans, that's just another example of how I think there's energy building and people starting to pay attention to a place like Oregon and a suburb of Portland, of all places, where we think we can show that there is a tide that's turning. So let's start out with a little bit of your background so folks can get to know you. So what was it like serving in the Trump War Room in 2020? That must have been kind of an unforgettable experience.
Yeah, it was. So it's the first and only presidential campaign in my career. I've worked on a lot of different types of campaigns. I started on that campaign January 2019, I think, is when I started, and I was a regional director for delegates and party organization. I covered like 15 stage 3 territories. So I had the Pacific territories like American Samoa, Guam, and the Northern Marianas. So that was a great experience because I spent that portion of the campaign traveling all across the country, working with state parties, meeting with folks on the grassroots level to talk about the campaign and get folks excited. And, that was just honestly an honor. It was just a lot of fun. The second part of my job, it was around July of 2020, kind of after the first throes of COVID, if you will. I got tapped to be the National War Room Director, which basically meant that I had sort of two jobs. One was doing some internal research for the campaign, looking at things like polling and voter registration and sort of demographic trends, to just kind of research and write memos on and talk to people about. And then the second part of it, what really culminated on election night, where my job was to oversee the election night war room, where all the results were coming in from all the different states across the country, and try to get a sense, heads of tails, of kind of what was going on election night and if we were winning or losing and all that sort of stuff. And that was a really, really unique experience. I had done plenty of war rooms before for other campaigns, never one at that scale. So it was just a really, really intense day. I think I started my job at about 3 a.m., I guess, the morning of the election. And then we worked until in that one office, we worked until about 5 a.m. the next day. So Wednesday morning. And then after that, I think I slept under my desk for 2 hours and then got back to work. I think I went home. The first time I went home to take a shower was like on Thursday or something like that. It was wild.
Wow. Yeah, that's the thing about working in these types of roles, is that you get to sleep in the most unergonomic possible setting, because the job really doesn't end just because the sun goes up or down. In fact, it might just start like it did at 3 a.m. for you, where you're going the entire time. And of course, that was a roller coaster of results that went on for days.
It was, and obviously, at a certain point too, it obviously, not to go into everything regarding the election, but there was a certain point where it stopped being what I would call a political battle, where guys like me look at the results and try to discern what voters are doing what. It obviously became more of a legal battle, at which point other folks in the campaign kind of took the reins, and then from there we know the rest of the story.
Yep. Yeah, you pass the baton to the lawyers. Yeah. So now, what are some of your thoughts and recollections of Oregon? Because of course, we always have been fighting the good fight here for years, and our prospects go up and down with different election cycles. But um, Oregon is a place that you have this kind of deep going experience that not everybody has when they come out here to start getting involved.
Yeah, look, I've always had a soft spot and a passion for Oregon politics, and it's a for a few reasons. So one, originally I'm from Louisiana, moved around the country, and it was after Chris Christie's reelection campaign in 2013 that I worked on that had the opportunity to move out to Oregon. And I had a few other opportunities. I think Iowa was in the mix. There was a campaign in Delaware I was talking to, and something in Georgia. Oregon really struck me. Besides living somewhere beautiful and fun to live, the politics of Oregon, obviously, it's very much a blue state in how it votes. It has been historically since probably the late 70s, early 80s. You've obviously had some Republicans since then. You've had some Republican control, but it's trended blue really for, I would say, most of my lifetime, most of our lifetime, if you're under 50. That said, what's started to happen, I would argue, probably around 2012, if you were paying attention, and really ramped up during 2016, and you even saw it in 2020, was a political realignment. And for those that are political science majors or political science nerds, a realignment is a technical term that we use in political science that basically says, look, these people that used to think they're Democrats are now becoming Republican. These folks that used to think that they're Republican are now becoming Democrat. And it's been really clear for at least the past decade that we've been in the middle of one of those realignments. And Oregon is a state that benefits from a Republican perspective. You can think of Georgia, for example, as being one that benefits from a Democrat perspective. Obviously, because Democrats have been able to get elected there a little bit more often. So what I mean by that in Oregon is you have this situation where if you look at the coast, and you saw this with some of your House races in 2020, your state House races, where seats that were historically Democrat flipped to Republican. You had the one up in Astoria, and you had the one down in Coos Bay. Yep. And I think there was a Senate seat down there that flipped in the Coos Bay area that flipped Republican as well.
That's right.
So that's something that you're seeing in Oregon, and then on top of that, you are also seeing some of the suburbs of Portland. Think of like Hillsborough or even parts of Clackamas County becoming more blue. So Oregon is in this position where, because of these demographic changes, I would say it's much more purple now than it was when I originally moved out there in 2014 and really started working in 2015. So that's the, I would say, the overarching long-winded answer to your question is, what I care about Oregon or what's special about it to me. And the last thing I would say on it too is what's really interesting about Oregon right now is Oregon has really been this example of what happens when you have absolute Democratic control in the Pacific Northwest, or the West Coast for that matter, right? You have obviously federally, you have a Democrat president, you have a Democrat Senate, Democrat House. And then Oregon, everything's controlled by Democrats. And what you've seen in Oregon is what happens when that experiment goes to its fullest extent. And I think it's fair to say, I'm sure most of the folks that are listening tonight haven't been happy with that for a long time. And rightfully so. But there are more and more people, I'd say specifically under the last 4 to 5 years of Kate Brown's leadership, that are really concerned and are really waking up and realizing, what, maybe the Democratic Party isn't the party for me. Maybe it's time for me to look at other options. And frankly, I know some of the candidates that are running in Oregon up and down the ballot, and you've got some great Republican choices this year.
Yeah, we're one of the most the starkest bad examples of how to run a state that can be seen throughout the country. And before we went on the air, you mentioned that you noticed in 2020 something different, because it's like a boutique thing. Like those of us who know what's going on in Oregon, or I think you use the analogy Dungeons and Dragons. It's like, yeah, this crazy thing called Portland and the stuff they're doing out there. And then all of a sudden, everybody was asking you about it.
Right. Well, and just to kind of talk about the realignment that's happening nationally, right, and where Oregon plays into that. So most people that most people would recognize that there is a realignment happening, that work in politics. And if you're to say where's that realignment benefiting Republicans, they'd say states like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Iowa's
Ohio.
another,
Yeah.
Ohio, which is basically a red state at this point.
Yep.
Even Florida, which is less swingy than it has been probably for my entire political career. Um, so that's where most folks like me would say that's where the realignment's happening. And I would agree with all those, but I would add Oregon on there. And I would kind of be the nut job in the room if I put Oregon. There was like maybe a small cadre of people that I knew out here on the East Coast that would see Oregon as a part of that realignment. And then obviously in 2020, what you had happen was, as most of you know, especially if you live in the metro Portland area, is Portland was making the news almost on a nightly basis. The riots that were happening out there, Antifa,
Flames in the background.
all this sort of stuff. I mean, it was post-apocalyptic out there. And that obviously caught the attention of a lot of folks on the East Coast. And, it's frankly, I mean, Oregon became a little bit of a laughing stock. Like how crazy do you have to be to light your city on fire every night? And, that, I think to a certain extent, I mean, I think kind of helps the conservative cause out there because it gave more attention to Oregon. B, like I was telling Kevin before the show, it was certainly interesting for me as someone that had, if I ever talked about Oregon politics out here on the East Coast, people would be like, would look at me like I had crabs crawling out of my ears. Now a lot of folks nationally are interested in Oregon, and frankly, you're seeing that with your races this cycle. You have the Republican Governors Association very much invested in your Republican gubernatorial candidate, Christine Drazan. You've got the NRCC looking at several races out there, and getting involved. I know CLF, they're sort of a congressional leadership fund is spending money out there on behalf of congressional candidates. Like you've got, and these are things that don't normally happen. To be clear, these are things that if you're in Oregon, you're typically not getting help from Space Command. You don't have the RNC and the NRCC and all these national organizations coming in. And these organizations aren't charitable, by the way. They don't do this because they want to do a favor. They do this like they are very much like venture capitalists when it comes to politics.
Yeah,
If they're
they bet on horses. Yeah, that's right.
Exactly. If they're investing money, it's because they see a shot in winning. And that's a really exciting thing to see. And it just doesn't happen in Oregon that often. And I should say, I left one committee out. I know the RSLC, which deals with more legislative races, and they've been helpful in Oregon in the past. But I think they're actually setting records in terms of the amount that they're being helpful this cycle too, in terms of the amount of money that they're investing. So it's a little cliche to say something's once in a lifetime in politics, especially when you work in politics long enough. You know that that's not true. So stuff is cyclical and it always kind of happens over and over again. But this is certainly the first time in my political career where I've seen so many national conservative organizations interested in Oregon. And I think that's everything that we just kind of talked about coming to fruition.
Yeah, I've never seen all of them at the same time like this doing this. That's what's really crazy. Is usually it would be like, oh, this is a good cycle for a couple of congressional races, or maybe it's a presidential year that they're investing, or in another cycle, it might be a gubernatorial one. We're getting like all this stuff coming in, as you said, including state legislative races. And the Democrats have worked extremely hard at making this happen for us by taking the most extreme policies that frankly seem to be reflected shockingly by a so-called moderate at the national level, seem to be reflected in national politics. So maybe some people are looking at what's happening here and saying, not only is this a warning to the rest of the country, but we better fight this in Oregon too, because people in Oregon are starting to say, I am really not happy with how things, well, we don't have the nation's least popular governor in her own state for nothing, right?
Right. Well, and the other thing with Oregon too, and this was something that was told to me before I moved out to Oregon, and this is probably one of the reasons I wanted to go out there, is the West Coast. So I would say Washington, Oregon, and California combined is almost like a petri dish for the leftist socialist ideas, right? And once they're successful in getting them passed legislatively out there, they export that to the East Coast. And if you and the examples I give, so sanctuary cities, which we don't seem to
Mm.
talk about as much anymore, but were definitely a thing a couple of years ago and was a hot political topic. The first San Francisco, the first sanctuary city that I think actually called itself that was San Francisco.
Yeah.
Um, driver's licenses for illegal immigrants. It's a super hot topic nationally now. I believe Oregon might have been the first state to institute that, if I recall.
And they did it after the people of Oregon actually voted to reject it, and they did it anyway.
Right, right. And then on top of that, and $15 minimum wage, which is something that feels like a normal thing now. That started in Seattle. Seattle was the first city to institute that. So all of these things that you're seeing Democrats push for in the U.S. Congress, and you're seeing Biden tout now, all of these bad ideas started on the West Coast. Some of them actually in Oregon.
Yeah.
Automatic registration.
Oh yeah.
That I believe Oregon might not have been the first. It might have been Washington, California before it. But but it's like any bad idea that you see AOC rambling on about, or you see Joe Biden sputtering about, one of those three states started it. So I'd always tell folks, I do have a certain appreciation for folks that work on the grassroots level in Oregon, Washington, and California, because you're quite literally kind of behind enemy lines. I mean, you are the 101st Airborne, kind of fighting, before we can go land on the beaches. I mean, it's not an easy place to be. It's not as easy as going and campaigning for Republicans in Texas or Mississippi or Alabama. It isn't. So, hats off to all of you on here that do that.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we've become familiar with is how to pay attention to and start to counter some of the things, the messaging that you hear from Democrats, because when they're trying to ply people with those messages here, we get practice. And then when I talk to people in other parts of the country, I'm like, "That's really good. Where'd you get that?" And I'm like, "I live in Oregon." So they've been
Right.
doing it to us for a couple of years, and we figured out here's what you say to counter it. And also, I think you remember the old Bugs Bunny Roadrunner cartoons when somebody would start smoking a cigar and it actually turned out to be a stick of dynamite and it blows up in their face. It kind of feels like that's what's happened with Democrat policies. Like they've done it to themselves, because one of the starkest ones, and the one that I think is a warning, and it's central to the gubernatorial campaign, was when they decriminalized meth, heroin, fentanyl, and what happened? The state became flooded with meth, heroin, and fentanyl addicts under the guise of being homeless, but they're coming here and living in tents, and then they defunded police and shackled their ability to counter all the crime wave that's been instituted, and now we're being overwhelmed. And of course, we're
Right.
not the only place in the country, but we've done it on a statewide scale, and it's having an effect.
Right. No, it's absolutely nuts. And again, I feel for the folks that have to live through it and see it every day. I used to love going to Portland when I lived out there, and I still travel out there from work occasionally. And I kind of hold my breath as I drive through Portland. I mean, because it is. I mean, one, it's just, to be clear, it's a really sad sight to see
Yeah.
so many people that are hurting and struggling with addiction and abuse and homelessness. It is just it is a sad state for humanity, for us to be in 2022 and to see and have to see that thing every day. But then, for your government, the folks that are supposed to protect and serve the community, to be like, well, we think we'll fix it. One of the things that we'll do is we'll just make meth less illegal. Let's see how that goes. Like,
Yeah.
at a certain point, you can't. It's almost like you have to stop feeling bad and feel angry, because this isn't a natural disaster. This isn't like a hurricane came and wiped out a city and people are homelessness. This is a man-made crisis made by bad policy.
That's right. That's perfectly said. And we've seen a lot of people who didn't care about politics out here tuning in to these races now and making races in a state where the Democrats controlled redistricting. So they districted all this stuff. And yet there's 3 congressional races that look like they're in the competitive to semi-competitive category. District 5 is considered a toss-up nationally, and now the governor's race moved from lean Democrat to toss-up. And Christine Drazan, the Republican nominee, repeatedly in these polls now appears to be slightly ahead of the Democrat. And there's also a third candidate in the race. And 2 of the 3 candidates say they really dislike the progressive policies and oppose them. One of them, Christine Drazan, actually represents a across the board change in these policies. And there are literally people volunteering to help people find their stolen cars. We're like one of
Right.
the national capitals for stolen vehicles, and catalytic converter theft. We're like 5th or 6th in the country. And people, you were talking about Portland a few years ago. Yeah, that's the good old days when Portland was just weird and might
Right.
have some pretty boisterous protests, not burning the city down and attacking federal marshals, and then having people run around and break into stores and see the homicide rate double and triple within the span of a few years. It's just people are in shock right
Right.
now.
Right. Well, if I can, because you mentioned the governor's race, I want to touch on that for a second.
Yeah,
I mean, because
please.
you mentioned, two of the candidates, not liking these progressive policies, Christine Drazan being one of them. The one that you didn't mention, Betsy Johnson, who's running as an independent. I just want to flag one of the things that we say in Louisiana is, if you really think that Betsy isn't a Democrat or isn't a progressive, I've got some swampland to sell you back home.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's right.
that is, that rebrand, as we would call in the business, is quite a turn for her. Yeah, I mean, the reality is, I mean, she was a state senator when I was out there. She's
Yep.
just as liberal as anyone else. Just because you vote against one tax, or like in a session, and you vote for every other Democratic policy that comes across your desk, that doesn't all of a sudden make you a conservative. I'm sorry. It just, it certainly doesn't make you a moderate in my book. Um,
That's
maybe
true.
that's not.
Louisiana is a great example of a place where you do have, faux conservatives, right? That are Democrats and they claim to be running, and then they get in there and they're like, oh, they're Democrats.
I mean,
Uh,
look at it this way. If I were to go right now and go get a Big Mac meal at McDonald's, go get a Whopper meal at Burger King, then go to Taco Bell and get a chalupa meal, and then on my way back home, drink a protein shake, can I say that I'm on a diet?
yeah, that's
Like,
right. That's a great,
I mean,
great way to put it.
the reality is you got 2 Democrats and 1 Republican running. And 2 of them have just voted with Kate Brown or supported Kate Brown's policies 99.9% of the time. So, that's my take on it. The idea that you've got this like leftist and a moderate and a real conservative, that to me is, that's something that I think the Betsy team is trying to brand the race as. The truth is, you got one weird Portland liberal, you got one weird historian liberal, and then you got Christine Drazan, then the actual conservative in the race.
Yeah, and they say she's tough and a fighter, Betsy, but she was a tough and a fighter fighting for Kate Brown. Who did she support in the governor's race? Kate Brown, the least popular governor in the country. She delivered those policies. She helped to make that happen. And if folks want something really different than what they're getting, if they finally had enough of this, then you're really talking status quo there. And people don't seem to be in a status quo mood right now at
Right.
all.
Well, and the other thing too is from a technical standpoint, getting aside, taking away the ideology and just the politics of it as, for a second, and just looking at a race where you have a Democratic nominee, a Republican nominee, and an independent candidate who I'll give her a little bit of rope here. I'll say that she's left leaning, right? Which
Hmm?
she leans pretty far, but I'll just say a left leaning independent. Independents winning statewide, I mean, for any race for that matter, for an independent winning, it's extremely difficult. The reality is we are a two-party system. The vast majority of voters identify with a political party, even those that are registered as non-affiliated or unaffiliated. 90% of them, if you have to actually go and talk with them, will express a partisan viewpoint one way or the other. Um, Americans are partisan people, and we live in one of the most heightened times of partisanship in the last 100 years.
Yep.
So the chances of Betsy winning, frankly, are zilled and none as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
If I was if I was a bookie in Vegas setting the odds, I mean less than 1% chance. I am extremely bearish on her opportunity to win. That said, I think what's really interesting about that race is because she is a independent that was, I guess, formerly a Democrat, like Prince was formerly an artist or whatever he was back then. Um, she is going to take away more votes from the Democratic base than she is Republicans, which allows for this really unique situation for a plurality win to occur for a Republican candidate. And one of the things that, and again, if you go look at, like we said at the beginning of the show, Oregon's a blue state. But one of the things about Democratic power in Oregon, if you look at it, is the way it's a mile wide, but it's only an inch deep. What I mean by that is, yes, Democrats control everything, but if you look at the margins in which they win by, they're relatively small.
Yeah.
You don't have Democratic candidates winning statewide by 15, 20 points. It's usually single digits. One of the things I pointed out when I worked at the House caucus, and obviously I think the House, I think, is still in a super minority right now by 1 or 2 seats, give or take. We weren't in super minority when we were out there, but I did the math. I looked at the races that we lost in 2014. And if you add up the amount that we lost each race by, the difference between Republicans controlling the speakership and Democrats controlling the speakership was only about 3,000 votes.
Yeah, I remember that.
If
Yeah.
3,000 or maybe 3,500, 3,200, something like that, 3,200 people in an entire state, obviously in a few key districts, but if they had flipped that vote by 3,200 votes, let's say, that's a really small amount. But that small amount obviously resulted in an immense amount of power for the Democratic Party and Democratic candidates in Oregon. So that, I think, is what's so special about this cycle, is because of some unique circumstances. The fact that you've got, a Democrat running as a fake independent, you've got Tina Kotek running as the actual Democrat nominee, who was the speaker when I was out there, and she's absolutely bonkers. Add all that together, you've got this really interesting opportunity there. And like you said, with the congressional races, Democrats tried their best to gerrymander the state. I mean, that's why I think every district except for 2 touches Portland in some way. Go figure. I guess Portland needs as much help as they need in Congress. I guess that's the logic there. But the reality is, even with them trying to do that, because of the realignment that's happening in Oregon, you actually saw Oregon 5 become more conservative after it was redrawn. I want to say modeling had Oregon's 5th congressional at like D+8, D+9 in the old district, and now depending on what model you look at, the best is like D+1 to R+1. Like and obviously the polling shows Lori DeRemer up. The last poll that was reported on last week had her up by like 10 points. I don't think there's been a public poll that's shown Lori DeRemer losing. Like, she's been up in all of them.
And her opponent defeated a so-called blue dog Democrat because, all the progressive groups came in and supported this McLeod Skinner candidate, who is way to the left. She's a Bernie Sanders acolyte. And I guess the Democrats really don't think there's any problem with doing that. I don't see any problem with it because I think it's contributing to these margins that you talked about in a year when people want somebody who's professional, smart, competent, and not off the charts on the left, but somebody who's going to probably deliver some policies that'll solve some problems, which there are way too many of those problems right now.
No, that's right. That's right. So I think Oregon 5 is going to be an extremely interesting race to watch. I guess I should say, for listeners, like, that's a race I'm also involved in professionally. So that's why I'm not dancing around that a little bit. But it's it's definitely something. I think Lori DeRemer's obviously running a great campaign. She's a great candidate. And you've got a lot of opportunities out there, even in Oregon 6 and Oregon 4. I mean, you've got these really good really good Republican candidates running, and that's not always the case, to be honest. In previous cycles, you just haven't had what I would say bluntly are top tier candidates, and it feels like in every race right now that you have in Oregon, regardless of where you live, you have the opportunity to vote for some really, really cool people.
Yeah, they're competent, and they're well supported financially. Although I think they, we always have to have resources coming because we don't get all this free coverage from the media or the suppression in the other direction that Democrats enjoy. But at the same time, you got Alex Skarlatos down in CD4, you got Mike Erickson in CD6, where Alec is known to the voters in CD4 because he ran in 2020 against the Democrat incumbent who was the chair of the transportation committee and didn't deliver very much in transportation, actually, for a district that desperately needed it. And Mike Erickson's opponent is a far left Democrat legislator, and Andrea Salinas. And yeah, we don't know how that district's ultimately going to perform because there isn't any history to a new district, but Mike has some resources and some name recognition, and there's a good reason. I mean, we're the grand optimistic party, and you really have to stay optimistic in a state like this when you see good candidates coming up against people who truly represent. They truly represent just where the Democrat Party has gone, which is they love these policies that have made a mess of things. They think they're awesome. Which is, I don't know. They must not care what their pollsters are saying anymore. But and what are some of the main issues that you think are, like, as a Marine colonel friend of mine likes to say, steel on target here, where when we talk about them, that's really resonating with voters, particularly out here. But we know that the rest of the country has many of these same issues.
Well, so obviously jobs in the economy, especially if you do any polling, that always pops up. Now, what kind of bothers me about saying that is it feels cliche to say because obviously because it's consistently an issue in most elections year after year. It's just the reason why it's an issue changes a little bit. I think specifically right now, the unique issues on why the economy is important to people, it has to do more with, price inflation, and things of that nature, which is kind of like this hidden tax on American citizens, where everything's just more and more expensive. You're not necessarily getting, cost of living increases with your wage. Some people are on fixed incomes, becomes extremely difficult. So, I think and obviously I think Democrats are, generally speaking, not considered great on economic issues. Just generally, if you were to go ask any voter, hey, would you prefer a Republican or a Democrat in terms of improving the economy? 9 times, well, maybe not 9 times out of 10, 6 or 7 times out of 10, they'll say, I want the Republican to do it. So that is something that I would say is beneficial for Republican candidates, is that's the number one issue. It's an issue that that most Republican candidates, campaign very well on. Oregon does have some unique issues, and it kind of harkens back to my days in Louisiana when I first started working on campaigns. So when I first started working on campaigns, it was in Louisiana right after Hurricane Katrina. The number one issue, and I was the Metro New Orleans area, was crime. Crime was really bad, especially right after Katrina. We actually, the National Guard actually came into New Orleans to help combat some of the rise in crime at the time. It was what's interesting to me now, and you're seeing this in other states as well, but I think in Oregon, because of some of the stuff we talked about earlier, the rise in crime in Portland, that's becoming a bigger and bigger issue for voters. Is they want their elected officials to do something about it, because it's becoming too big of a problem. I think the homicide rate in Portland's gone up something like 800% since the last year, like crazy figure. Yeah. So the fact that you've got, and again, if you talk about crime, who's better at, law enforcement issues? I'll give you a hint. It's not the party that wants to defund the police.
Right.
That is,
or says they're all racist.
Right. So, those are two issues that I think are really important to talk about. The other thing in Oregon is obviously the homelessness issue, too, which, the thing with homelessness that is, I think missed by previous Republican campaigns is, yes, homelessness is an issue that requires empathy and trying to figure out how to solve. Because again, you do have these sad human stories in terms of how people got there. But the reality is, when most voters are saying that homelessness is an issue that they're concerned about, it really has to do more with the crime that comes from a rise in homelessness.
Yes.
So it's almost like a subset of crime being a problem. Those two issues are very much correlated in the minds of voters. So I think from a messaging perspective, really, fixing crime, fixing homelessness is really important. The last thing, and I can say this, as a parent, with one kid in school and another kid, getting ready to start next year, is you know what education is for this next generation. I mean, the reality is high school graduation rates, other educational issues in Oregon weren't great before the pandemic. I think the pandemic really opened up some real flaws in our education system nationally, but also in Oregon specifically, because you weren't in a good starting point. The reality is there are first and second graders that are behind in reading and math now because they had to conference in and Zoom every single year. While it was okay to go walk in a Walmart or grocery store, kids couldn't go to school. I think a lot of folks saw the hypocrisy during the pandemic on what you were allowed to do and not allowed to do, and they kind of realized the political games being played. And unfortunately, one of the pawns in that political game were our children. And I think
Indeed.
that's another issue that has voters really, really incensed. It's one of the reasons that I think you saw Virginia turn out the way that it did with Glenn Youngkin winning in 2021.
Yeah.
Is that I think was almost a direct rebuke to some of those policies.
Yeah, it was the education moms that suddenly started coming, and dads for that matter,
Sure.
who just said that they were not going to tolerate this anymore, and they had a rude awakening, didn't they? That the people who had the most power over their education system weren't the parents. It was other groups that were politically connected, that at times were literally, and we've had this here in Oregon, rooting for the schools to be open less and to spend less time in the classroom. And then you see the results that they were getting before COVID hit. It kind of put the lie to who's trying to produce better educational outcomes. Well, not somebody who wants there to be actually less days of classroom
Right.
instruction. And then on top of that, I think that a lot of folks have become a bit disenchanted with what they learned was being taught in classrooms when their kids are at home. This the system out here seem to rely heavily not only on Zoom, but on the idea that there's just no accountability within the system. So parents have been, it varies from one city or county jurisdiction to the other, but is 8 to 10% of the students have disenrolled from the public school system and tried to find an education somewhere else in 1.5 years, which is an enormous change. And yet they're saying they don't have enough money. So
Right.
people are just not buying this anymore.
Right, right. Well, I'm looking at the Facebook comments. I just want to point out. I mean, Lori is 100% correct. She said it was bad before COVID, and that just shined a spotlight on things. Absolutely. I mean, I would say that it shined a spotlight, and it ripped open the scars to where it was where basically what parents realized during the pandemic was that they did not have a voice in their kids' education. I think that's
Yep.
the best way to surmise it, and that's what you're seeing more and more of from parents is they don't want to give up on the public education system. At least not all of them do. Frankly, not all of them can afford to. Most of them can't afford to. um, and the but they want to make sure that they have a choice in their kids' education. They want to make sure they have a voice in their kids' education. And when they hear from teachers unions or from school board members that nope, it's our way or the highway. By the way, FBA may or may not be watching you at the school board meeting. That's when
Right.
parents are like, you know what, done with it. And you're seeing them get proactive, and you're seeing them vote. And that is a group of people that to your point. I mean, I remember in the late 90s you would talk about soccer moms as a swing vote. School board moms are a swing vote in
Yep.
2022.
Yeah, and you don't want to mess with school board moms. Whatever they did to provoke them, that was probably one of the biggest political mistakes they could have made. That's you
Sure.
and I know both how we feel about our kids, and if you start messing with them, we get pretty upset.
Right.
That's like 10x on a school board mom there.
Well, and look, not to draw out my inner candidate, but if I was talking about my personal philosophies, I'm a big believer and always have been that m- most of your woes in society, whether it's rising crime or inequality or any problem that we face as a country, it's solved through a good education system. Good education results in less crime. It results in more equality. It results in more opportunity. It results in more success. So anytime that we do anything that diminishes our ability to educate kids and to get them ready for the next stage in life, we're doing them an injustice, and we're doing this country an injustice.
Yeah, and when we see, and this is actually another stark example of Portland and Oregon and what happens on the left coast, when we see what some young people uh, who think what Antifa is doing in the city of Portland is actually a great thing, and that they need to do more of it, that they actually want to engage in that kind of activity as if it's sanctioned or permissible. That started somewhere in the education system at some point where they were led to believe that that's actually legitimate political activism, and so much so that we ended up having a candidate that fell only narrowly short of becoming the mayor of Portland, who said that she was the Antifa candidate for mayor. I mean, this stuff you can't. No one would have believed a movie where someone actually said, "Here's the plot. We're going to have rioters elect a candidate that's going to represent them and burning the city down."
Right. Yeah, I mean, look, it's hard for me to unpack. I don't know if I can get in a mental state where I can see myself, or I can understand why someone joins Antifa or goes and riot in the street. I feel like I've been pretty mad and upset before. I've never been mad enough to throw a brick at a Starbucks. You know, eh, there are a lot of problems in this country. There's a lot of, in terms of how people behave and how people get involved politically. Because to your point, I mean, look, I obviously have a passion for politics, so much to the point that I do it for a living. I think
Yep.
there are plenty of healthy ways to get active politically, supporting candidates, supporting issues, supporting ballot initiatives. Never would I tell somebody that a great way to get active politically is to go and cause mayhem in your hometown or in your streets. Like, that is just not a good form of political discourse. And um, that is, and like you said, in Oregon, uh, it obviously came to light in 2020. Nationally, I think is when you saw it, but I remember quite clearly it was a problem in Portland before then.
Yeah.
I remember when Trump won in 2016,
Oh
and
yeah.
there were riots and protests in Portland that were so bad that the folks that worked in the legislature that commuted down from Portland couldn't drive down. They stayed in their home until it died down a few days later. Um,
Yep.
the it just took a few years for the rest of the country to catch up to the craziness, but we're all there now, and hopefully we can figure out a way to get out of it.
So just in kind of wrapping up here, when I think about the national mega trends that are going on, um, are some of those impacting Oregon and perhaps even helping people see things? Because I mean, a couple of years ago, we were told that everything would be solved by some moderate president that was going to be elected, and that we're going to get all these policies that were going to unify us, and we're all going to talk civilly again. And then we saw what happened, a couple weeks ago, when the president of the United States gave a speech that sounded like maybe you and I are the problem.
Yeah, it looked like he was like giving a speech on what was not the Death Star, the newer Star Wars. Like it was like the Death Star 2.0, whatever they
That's
called it.
right.
Like,
Yeah, they
I mean,
call him Darth Brandon is what somebody came
that
up with. I
looked, yeah, I mean, that looked pretty dystopian to me. I didn't, I watched that speech. I didn't get the warm and fuzzy, like we're having a conversation together feeling. If that's what they were going for, I'm gonna go ahead and say, as a media consultant, they didn't do a good job. I think it's fair. I can point that out. But no, look, we're definitely a more partisan country than we have been in a while. There's plenty of studies that show nationally partisanship is increasing. Um, and Oregon is unique. I say this all the time. Every state, thinks it's unique, and every state is right and wrong at the same time. Yes, there are very unique, idiosyncratic things about Oregon, the issues you care about, the people that live there that make it a special place. But we're all the same species. We all, kind of come from are cut from the same cloth, and we react to stimuli in a very similar way. And that's what we're seeing. So some of the national trends that we're seeing, whether it be the jobs and economy or crime or homelessness or immigration, all those issues affect voters in Oregon just as much as they do in other states. There might be some unique ways as to how they affect people, but there's going to be a lot of similarities there. And as you can see nationally, there are trends that show that, if you look at 538, I think they give Republicans like a 75% chance of taking back the House. You look in Oregon, I think they give Lori DeRemer a 67% chance of winning in Oregon 5. Other candidates are not that far behind on the Republican side. So you're seeing some of those national trends play in Oregon as well. And it'll be interesting to see if those all come to fruition in November.
Yeah, Nancy Pelosi actually came out here to both fundraise for Democrat candidates for Congress in Oregon and to try and draw media attention to how important these races were. And she said, and I quote, "These races could make the difference between keeping or not keeping the House of Representatives,"
That's right.
which she's a pretty busy lady. She's got hundreds of seats to fight for, and certainly dozens and dozens of swing seats. And she came to Oregon, where she's never, had to do anything like that in recent memory.
Yep. It's gonna be a wild election. Like I said, I don't want to say it's a once in a lifetime thing, because I feel like too many people say that and it's lost all of its value. But it's certainly a rare opportunity. The opportunities in elections like this don't happen in Oregon that often. It's certainly the first one in my experience, which lends me to believe that if we don't take advantage of it now, there won't be another opportunity like this in a long time.
Yep, that's a pivotal one, and it's a certainly the canary in the coal mine has been screaming here for a couple of years so now,
Right.
and it might have been partisan a couple of years ago. Now it's partisan, and we have 10 more crises than we had back then.
Right.
So it's got to be the time for the message to get through. Well, Dave, any last things you wanted to share with folks? What they need to think about? What do they need to do here in the coming 60 days?
Well, I would say this, and this might sound small, but I know you have enough listeners where it's going to add up. Anyone that's listening that wants to help Republicans win, call 5 of your friends that aren't politically active and make sure that they're voting for Republican candidates up and down the ballot wherever they live. If each and every one of the folks listening tonight do that, that will make an impact. Telling your friends and family to vote Republican is extremely, extremely important. The second thing, since we did mention the Reagan dinner at the very beginning of this show, so Dan Mason, who puts on that event, is a great friend of mine. I feel like he'd be mad at me if I didn't plug it. Another way to support Republican candidates, if you haven't already, go to the Reagan dinner. Mike Pompeo is the keynote speaker. There'll be some other great speakers that are talking there. Get your ticket now before they sell out. And then Dan, if you're listening, I expect the check to be in the mail.
I'll post a link here as well so that folks can find that. And it is definitely a unique event here in Oregon where you think, well, hey, those people don't come to Oregon. Actually, they do.
They do.
Come to the
I'm flying out there. I'm
Yep.
flying out there. I'm traveling 3,000 miles to be at that event. So if you live in Salem, you can drive the 40 to get there.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I want to really thank you for actually on such short notice too, taking the time to come and talk with us and help people understand what's happening in Oregon. How that, because you're bringing in that view of not only understanding Oregon, but how folks outside of Oregon are viewing this, and it's serious. Like this is a real chance across major races that we could win and make a huge difference in a state that so many people I've talked to, sometimes they throw in the towel. I'm like, no, don't throw in the towel. We've got it. let's get this, you
There are a
know.
lot of folks out there fighting to win. So trust me, if you're working on behalf of Republicans, you've got an army behind you this cycle.
Absolutely. Once again, Dave, good luck with everything that you're working on, and uh, definitely keep us in the loop on anything that happens going forward. And anytime you want to come on and talk to us and pump people up or give them information that you think is vital, just let us know. Folks are, you can see on the feed, are really appreciative of that. So thank you for joining me here tonight.
Oh, thanks for having me. Y'all have a good one.
All right. Hey, everyone, please share this show with everyone you know. We stream live on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. We're going to be adding more social media avenues here going forward. And please also do join us tomorrow night for another episode of The Captive Audience. We should have two of our regular hosts, Sunny Danforth and David Darnell, on to talk about what's happening in the news and reacting to that and keeping you well informed. Once again, we appreciate your time, and we will see you tomorrow night on The Captive Audience. Good night, everyone.